.NET Web Development with Glenn Condron.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm executing complex projects for companies that have really mission-critical projects, and you can find them at clearmeasure.com. Quick announcement, we're in our second year of my architect forums. Signups for the next sessions are up. And if you lead a software team and you're looking to collaborate with other peer software architect leaders, then you can just sign up at the link in the show notes. And for those of you who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show, returning guest from episode 58, Glenn Condron. He's a principal product manager for the app platform team within the developer division at Microsoft, and he focuses on everything .NET. And before joining Microsoft, Glenn was a developer in Australia where he worked on software for various government departments. Glenn, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
I am good. Thank you for having me. It's been a long time, but I remember that first time I was in a special podcasting room that Microsoft Studios had. It was fancy. Not that anybody got to see it, but yeah. I also just realized how versatile Palermo is as a last name. Programming with Palermo, party with Palermo. You're getting like the most bang for your buck out of having your name start with a P. I like it.
That's right. Although my wife kind of jibes me a little bit for all the alliteration.
Yeah, alliteration is strong.
It works. Well, we just got to see each other in person a couple of weeks ago. That was fun.
Was at the summit?
Yeah, but for those who maybe haven't heard some of your material or haven't seen your presentations or the previous episode, can you give those listeners just a quick rundown of maybe the high points of your career that maybe led you up to actually being able to work deep in the .NET team today?
Yeah, okay, sure. So as you said in the beginning, I started out as a dev in Australia. I worked for a couple of like companies that did, contracts for other people, but I was working in Canberra, so most of those contracts were for government departments because that's what you do when you're a software developer in the capital city. I worked there for a while, and one of the people that I worked with was Paul Badham, who is an engineer who worked on Zumo and then became an engineer and worked on functions and a few other things in Azure. And so at some point during when talking, he kind of submitted my resume, and that's how I ended up. That got me to an interview, and then I had to pass. So I actually did like two or three interviews for various jobs, engineering jobs, PM jobs, all sorts of things. And that was many years ago, back when Microsoft used to move everybody to Redmond as soon as you got a job, which is a thing of the past now. Right. But yeah, then I spent some time on EF. I've actually worked at Microsoft for like 11 or 12 years now, and I don't think I've ever worked on anything that was closed source, which is interesting interesting for people who perhaps are less familiar with the Microsoft space. Probably most of your listeners probably are like, yeah, that sounds about right. I worked for a bit on EF, and then I started on this thing that internally we call Project K, which became .NET Core eventually. And I was one of the first PMs to start working on that as an IC, and then eventually became a manager and a manager of managers, as is the way once you decide that it's okay to give up your IC-ness, your individual contributorness. Yeah, I actually told my story. There was a manager forum earlier today where I told the story about how I was convinced to stop being an individual contributor and become a manager, which I never thought I would do. But yeah, most of the time I've spent working on kind of back-end web stuff, mostly back-end web stuff and cloud native stuff as cloud native became a thing, containers. If you're a .NET dev, then a lot of things I worked on as an IC were things like HTTP Client Factory and like health checks and a bunch of those kind of cloud native things that we're now using in .NET. Nowadays, I am the manager of a team of all the PMs who are basically everything that's not tooling or Maui is probably the fastest way to describe what all of my PMs actually own.
Mm-hmm.
So ASP.NET, all the web stack, where I came from as an IC, and then I also own now all the libraries, runtimes. I own like data and EF, all of our AI and ML work that's happening in .NET, and or any Aspire, the newer Aspire stuff, which we talked about last November, but we haven't actually like GA'd yet, which we should probably talk about a bit today. All those things fit within my PM team.
That's a lot of stuff. Do you ever sleep?
Increasingly no. I have this people who can't see the camera. I'm holding up a Monster Energy drink, and I live off of them, as far as I can tell.
Well, you mentioned .NET Core and all your stuff has been open source.
Yeah.
There's so many developers that have come into the industry, even according to some of the surveys, like the last 6-7 years, we have twice as many developers as before. And so there's a lot of, I guess about half of the current coders.
Interestingly, even though there's so many developers, also still several million below demand.
Yeah, good point.
Yes, even though there is lots and lots of new developers, and lots of new developers coming into the industry in less, say, traditional forms, self-learning, doing boot camps and things like that, we are still not keeping up with the demand, and the demand is still increasing faster than the supply of people who are developers still.
Right. And you mentioned .NET Core, and there's an old .NET, and then there's a new .NET, and there's a whole lot that's different.
Okay, so you want to talk about that? Okay, so let's go back a little bit further. I could just describe the difference, but let's go back a little bit to the history. So when I joined, and all of the work I did as an engineer before I joined Microsoft was .NET Framework. .NET Framework 2, 1.1, 2, 3. The world made sense. .NET was installed with Windows. It was source open, I guess you would call it. Like, it was not open source in the way that we would think of open source. You could see the source code, but you couldn't contribute to it.
Yeah.
It was out there, but you couldn't contribute.
And you couldn't compile it. And you couldn't compile it. You could just read it.
No, you couldn't build it. No, you couldn't build it or contribute in any meaningful way, but you could look at how we implemented stuff if you really wanted to. The main key thing there was less than open source. The key was it was part of Windows and still is part of Windows. So that led to a few things that were difficult. As I joined, we were starting to talk about this, and I was joining the WebStack team. And so some people like Scott Hunter and friends went to some web conferences. We were looking at how does .NET stay relevant for web devs, back-end and front-end web devs and full-stack web developers. And you go to web conferences of that era, and it's not that anybody didn't like Microsoft, but we were irrelevant. There was no reason to discuss Microsoft. So they weren't using .NET. They were using JavaScript. They were developing on Macs. VS Code hadn't been created yet. TypeScript had not been created yet. None of the things that every developer in the world uses now were a thing. And we looked at it and we were like, being Windows only, so not allowing developers to be able to dev on a Mac, when increasingly it's obvious that Windows is not going to be like dominate the web server workload, is destroying the ability of .NET to be successful. And also, who cares if it's not Windows only when really we're in this world of cloud now?
Yeah.
And so we had to make it all cross-plat. But then you've got this big .NET framework that is installed with Windows. It's gigabytes. A whole bunch of decisions were made during the designing of everything in order to make it very specific to Windows, because the point was to make Windows plus .NET be amazing together back in the day, right? So you can't just port it as is. Like, you can kind of do it. Mono kind of did it when early on. Mono is an open source, like, clean room port of .NET to other platforms. You can kind of do it, and we would have had to make a whole bunch of baking changes, like, because things just couldn't work the right way. And so we were in this world of like, well, if we really want to do this, this is probably our only opportunity to reboot the world, to take everything from .NET that still makes sense in this new era that we're moving to, make everything open source the entire thing, compiler, runtime, like libraries, everything open source, make it run on every OS. And how can we manage this? And so porting the whole thing was kind of a mammoth effort that we also didn't think made a lot of sense. Like, we left things behind in framework that didn't matter anymore. It's probably a good decision. And then we went on this journey of creating core. We called this .NET Core. It was like the core, like the best bits of .NET.
Right.
Over time, it grew as we added more and more stuff in, basically from people complaining. Like version 1 was very rough in terms of what you could and could not do. And then we got better. We added more stuff in. It got more and more complete, more and more able to do the modern workloads, and got more and more stable. Right. And then eventually, over time, what happened is the kind of management had said, when can like core just be .NET?
Yeah.
Like, when does it take over? When does it become .NET, the new thing that everybody likes, as opposed to the old thing that is built installed in Windows? And so at that point, there was a decision made to rename core to just .NET. And so the old one is .NET Framework, the middle one was .NET Core, and now it's just .NET, trying to say, okay, we're done with this transition period. There's just .NET now. We're moving forwards, and that is the path. And that's where you should be heading. That's where everybody should be heading. For a while, especially in the middle of when we were building up core, our guidance even said you should just stay on framework for a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. If you have been following along for a long time, back in the earliest days of core, we remember telling you not to use the web stack exposed to the public internet, right? Because we had no faith. Like we just built a brand new web server. We didn't know if it could work. And also there's a vast difference between building a web server that handles the like random internet as opposed to one that honors the spec. And we were confident we had one that honored the spec, but that is not the internet.
Right.
Nowadays, though, Kestrel, the web server, is like all traffic going through Azure App Service and a bunch of different Azure services is all going through it. It's blazingly fast. And handles all of the things that the internet has to offer, which is great.
I think the good point where newer developers, at some point, they're going to see a legacy system that they didn't build, and there's a big difference if they look in and say, "Oh, this is .NET 4 point something," versus looking in there and say, "Oh, it's .NET 5 plus." There's a big difference in that boundary.
One of the interesting things about changing the name from core to .NET is if that person was like, oh, this is .NET 4, and then they search for like newest .NET, it's going to be like 8 or something.
Yeah.
So at least they'll be like, oh, this thing's like 5 versions out a day. At least eventually as we go, right? So that's probably the only advantage that dropping the core had. It otherwise mostly causes confusion, unfortunately. But the goal was to make it so that when someone searches for .NET, they find the new thing. Because one of the things we've been constantly combating is just people have made a decision about what .NET was back in the day.
Right.
I talked to a few of them over these last couple of weeks. I just came from a tour of visiting a bunch of people who were using .NET in Brazil and Mexico, and there was just several times I hit people who were like, "Oh, I hadn't paid attention to this since you dropped Fox Pro or something, or or you dropped VB6 or something like that." I knew what .NET was back then, and I've not looked at it since because I didn't care about it. And now it's completely not that. Like, it's completely different. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, we have to try and walk this tightrope between we've created something that is distinctly different to what it used to be, but we also don't want to throw away. We don't want to make it too hard to make people think it's too drastically different, because it is still pretty similar in terms of the code you would write. Right? It's still C#. List is still a list.
Totally.
And so we've got to walk this tightrope between bringing the existing people we've got along, as well as like not making people who haven't paid attention or think .NET is something from back in the day that is not. It's hard. I don't think we've done enough yet. We've had hits and misses in terms of convincing people of that, but that's one of the challenges that we face on the .NET team, which is probably not a surprise to anybody who looks at the industry.
From my side, it's been really great since the .NET 5 rebrand, because clunky talking about .NET Core this and that, but since it's just .NET 6, 5, 6, 7, 8, now it's just, here's .NET. And of course, there were some breaking changes between major versions.
Every November, you get a new one. Every second one gets longer support. Go. It's consistent, it's stable, and it's running.
And we're 4 major versions back. I think we need to move this thing. That's an easier conversation. So.
Yeah, exactly. We ask every .NET Conf, every November, we ask people, how much do you care about? Like, what's your adoption policy? Like, what do you adopt? And it's something along the lines of 50%, I think, of the customer base only want to do LTS to LTS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that makes sense.
The rest, we use whatever. And I think that makes sense. Yeah. And that should mean we start to see waves. Mm-hmm. Every second release will be adopted like twice as much, because you bring along all the LTS to LTS people.
Right.
Anyone who doesn't know, LTS and STS is long-term support, short-term, so standard term support, something like that. but it's long and short. Ultimately, one of them you get an extra few years of you can call Microsoft for support, and we'll keep fixing bugs, security bugs and stuff.
Right.
Patch because there's a patch every month for every supported version. Is why we try to limit the number of concurrent supported ones at any one time. There was a period there back in the .NET Framework era, because .NET Framework had, I think, about 10 years of support. 4.8.1 is supported for as long as it's in Windows, which would be forever. There was a period there where I think the support team were patching like 15, 20, like a ridiculous number of versions of .NET were all supported at the same time. And it was costing a ridiculous amount to keep them all up to date, is why we tried to constrain it a lot more in the newer .NET. And it mostly follows the same as what you see in other places.
Right. Well, you were one of the presenters, and many people on your team presented at .NET Conf, new things that are coming up and ideas. What are some of those highlights where maybe those things you could foresee being GA at some point this year and people should really keep an eye on?
So the first and biggest one that we didn't ship, we talked about in .NET Conf, but we haven't actually GA'd yet, is a .NET Aspire. And so Aspire is a stack. There's a collection of kind of loosely coupled components that allow you to be far more productive building cloud native applications. And so the genesis for Aspire is that modern software development has this period of integration where you identify all the pieces that you're going to need. You find, I'm going to use Kafka, I'm going to use Redis, I'm using microservices or NT, or I'm doing whatever kind of roughly architecture stuff. And then you start pulling all the Lego out. Okay, I need an SDK for Kafka. I need the Redis. I need Stack Exchange Redis. I know I'm going to have to run like multiple like APIs. They're all going to talk to different databases. Like you start pulling it all together, integrating all this software, telemetry, diagnostics. Like what are all the solutions I'm going to use, logging, all of that. And within cloud native in particular, that aspect has become a full-time job. Like it is at this point where I could spend weeks or months doing that phase of integration, still not be confident I got it right, and have added no value to the business thing that I was actually trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And so what Aspire is trying to do is speed all that up. It's trying to give you great ways of running multiple applications, multiple projects together at the same time. Gives you a developer dashboard. So a dashboard with all your logs and your metrics and distributed traces for everything that you can see when you're developing at once to help you narrow in on problem areas. It has like an integration testing set up, so you can test like spinning up several services at once and doing a test and seeing if they all work. It supports depending upon containers. So like if you have your project and you run it and you know you need SQL every time you run your project, you can tell Aspire and it'll just spin up the SQL container for you, for example. So it does that. It also has a set of components, aspire.redis, aspire.kafka. And they don't abstract Aspire. They don't abstract Kafka SDK or Redis SDK, but they configure it for cloud native purposes. So if you're in the cloud, there's several things that you need. If you're going to use Redis, okay, this was on one of our early internal slides. We said if you want to use Redis today in a .NET app, outside of the abstractions, like if you're plugging it into caching or something, it's a little bit different. But if you're just going to grab Redis client and use it, then what you would have to do is get the Stack Exchange Redis. At least there's no competitors in this space, really. Stack Exchange Redis is really the only show in town. But for some other things, there might be 7 or 8. For Kafka, there's 2, and the one that seems the most obvious is actually not the best. For example, pick the right package. Then you need to add it to DI. What lifetime should it be? Don't know. Depends on how thread safe the SDK, like the client library is. I need to configure it. I need to figure out the connection strings to be able to talk to the Redis in dev. I need to figure out how my other devs are going to spin up Redis locally. Are they going to install it? Are they going to use containers? Where are they going to configure it? How can I make it F5able out of the box, or is there like a conf script that I need? Then you need to configure Redis to send all of its logs to the same place that all your stuff is going to be. So you've got to choose on your logging and your telemetry systems. You need to, if you're going to use health checks so that your project is like, so that Kubernetes, for example, knows if your project is healthy or not, you could use readiness and liveness probes. And if you know your functionality requires Redis and you can't communicate to Redis, then typically you want at least a readiness probe or something to turn off in Kubernetes so that you're not sending more traffic to a node that you know is not going to work. You might want to set up a flow like that you need to configure. And probably most importantly, what is the resiliency policy for this connection? Because if it's going to have transient like faults, what is the retry policy? Do I need exponential backoff? What does exponential even mean? I don't know. But these are all things that like can't start to become like suddenly these are all things you're confronted with. And we found two things that happened. Either that became a full-time job where you spend months setting something up and you know value was added, or you don't do a whole bunch of those things and then they bite you later on when you're in production and everything falls apart. And so we made it such that you add aspire.redis, it does everything I just described. It adds it to DI, it just sets up a default resiliency policy that you can configure for all of your projects. So every piece of an Aspire solution, for lack of a better word, uses OpenTelemetry as a standard. All of the data goes to an OpenTelemetry endpoint. The dashboard is an OpenTelemetry endpoint. Everything is configured to use a standard resiliency pattern. There are timeouts and retries for every outgoing HTTP connection, for every SDK call. We're setting you up by default in the beginning to be ready for cloud, because most of you all weren't until something fell over. One of the people on my team did a study of how people handled, faults and such in their production applications, and basically the answer was we have researchers who support us doing this work, and the researcher effectively said we should just cancel this study. I've never seen it converge to a point of singular answer as fast as what we have just done. And that convergence effectively was we don't do anything and then we put like a catch around it at the end and hope after it breaks and hope it's better next time. Just completely ignoring whole categories of problems in terms of how people do resiliency. And so these are all the problems that we're trying to solve with Aspire. And it will ship this year as part of .NET 8. It will be in .NET 8, but it will not be. It didn't ship in November because we weren't ready yet. So it'll be coming up in the next couple of months before November. In November, we'll have another one. We'll have like V2 or 1.5. So we'll have some number because we'll have GA'd before November when we ship 9, and then there'll be an Aspire version that is part of 9, and then after that, every year you'll get updates along with everything else. It should follow the same cadence. But the other thing about Aspire is that we have this monthly update cadence for patches I mentioned, because there is Aspire like packages that depend upon other people's libraries like Redis and Kafka and such. They also probably need to rev fairly regularly, so there'll be monthly updates as well. That is the thing that you should check out. There were some videos from me talking about it at .NET Conf. I'm sure there's other videos we've done since then out there that you could find. It is evolving rapidly, and it looks really, really good. People love the dashboard when they see it. In fact, one of the challenges is making people not fixate so much on the dashboard that they think that's what it is, which is why I glossed over it in the description that I just did now. But when people run a project that has like a front end and a back end API and a database, for example, let's just make it simple, end tier, simple-ish. And you one gesture, you run it, and then a dashboard pops up in the browser, and it shows you the 3 bits. You've never touched a connection string. You've never installed the database. You don't know. You've never configured port mappings. They all just get assigned for you, and everything works, and it's kind of magic. And then you see a distributed trace that shows you a request go from your web front end through the API into the database, and where all that time was spent across that entire request. And people were like, "Man, this is amazing." Now, none of that. You could do all of that I just described without Aspire, and you had to set it all up. Well, the dashboard didn't exist, but you could have grabbed a couple of different open source pieces of software, coupled them together. You could have gotten a dashboard. But putting it all together is what the value was.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo.
Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
I've been doing .NET development since the day that it came out. And one thing that's never been in there in the concept of a Visual Studio solution has been the runtime configuration of whatever was there. And there's always been, like a side console project or something just to, run some things at our local desk that's not really meant to be deployed anywhere, but maybe it's just a local tool that we happen to use. So you can't say everything that could run, is meant to be. So the configuration for, hey, what should we deploy and how should we deploy it? That was always outside of the VS solution. So that to me is a big idea of having in C# a project whose job it is to start up the application, which now is it's a distributed application. In other words, there's multiple things that have to be deployed and have to be online for this, logical software application to be functioning. And we've never had that before. So that's a big idea in my mind.
Yeah. And so Aspire will know all of the what. And then the how to go to a cloud, it will have some knowledge of via leaning on, like if you add an Azure specific package, you'll be able to do some Azure stuff in the C#, but or if you add an AWS package, you'll be able to do that. But by default, it doesn't know anything about explicitly the cloud that it's going to go to. Mm-hmm. But then there's a deployment chain, like the Azure Developer CLI knows how to see it. If you go AZD up, AZD init, and then AZD up in an Aspire like directory structure, it'll figure out that it's Aspire. And then it'll ask Aspire, what have you got? And then Aspire tells it, and then it knows how to then translate that into Azure Container Apps in this instance with AZD. So, for example, if you have our Aspire starter template, when you create it, it's a web app. It's the default Blazor front end with a weather page. The weather page calls a weather API to get the weather data. And I think it uses Redis to do output caching to cache the HTML result of the weather page. So it ties all that together in one go. You press run, that's what you get. And then if you AZD up and AZD init that thing will go all the way through to Azure Container Apps. It'll be running in the cloud. You don't even know where Redis come from. You just got a Redis. It's in the cloud. You could customize so that this uses a specific Redis that you know, but outside when you run AZD, it says, oh, I know how to take this project and run. AZD Container Apps has this ability to add a Redis add-on to your Container Apps cluster effectively. And so I'm going to do that, and we make sure all the config works, so all these services know how to talk to each other, and everything's good. So you can do that as like an easy mode button, and then you've also can deploy it the same way you've always deployed stuff. But Aspire knows all of the what, because it needs to know all of the what in order to be able to run it on your dev machine. But it doesn't always know how to get to a cloud, because that's you typically cross a line there somewhere.
So AZD is new. Now, I'm not saying literally new, but AZD hasn't been widely adopted yet. So for most developers, it's new, yes, but yet it's not Aspire. So maybe if someone's saying, you know what, I want to use all the cool stuff. I want to infrastructure as code. I want to do automated deployments, this and that. And, I'm going to use Azure pipelines. How does that modify how they use Azure pipelines, maybe different from the current documentation where you just had to pick every little step yourself?
Yeah. Depends what you want to do, right? So the Azure Developer CLI is it's a design, developer is the name because they wanted to create a command line experience that was thought of developers more than ops people, because they realized there was a split between the people using just AZ. Mm-hmm. So let AZ be for ops people and let AZD have more stuff that is more kind of developer friendly, or does the types of tasks developers want to do. It'll give you one command, go to Container Apps for an Aspire project. But there is also a thing, InfraSynth, I think is the name, but there is also a gesture which will just give you all the bicep that you can then go and tweak and you can run, that does everything that AZD would have done, because AZD at its core uses bicep to achieve everything. So you can also get it to generate all the bicep that it would have used, and then you can start customizing that and using bicep to do all of your infrastructure as codey kind of stuff. Or you could use Terraform or whatever else you wanted to do to replace that piece if you would want to. One of the things that is also not brand new but is new to lots of developers is that .NET, this is a slight tangent, but I want to throw it in because it's cool. .NET Build knows how to produce a container for a .NET app. on its own without Docker and without Docker files. So that means that you can just do a .NET gesture to be able to generate containers to go to any of the container-based platforms. I think that is cool because then you don't have to. Then your all of your DevOps pipelines aren't as worried about that because .NET Build generates an OCI compliant image you can push to any registry. So your pipeline is effectively build images, get them into a registry. Then you have some process of make sure that my container hosting platform is running. And then you've got some choices about, am I going to run Redis in the cluster or am I going to use like a managed Redis that I'm going to defend? Pick. Once you've made those choices, then your ongoing deployment process is doing that. And you can use Bicep, you can use Terraform. Nothing about Aspire makes any of this more difficult. Okay. What it does provide you is an easy button to get there when you're starting out and you're figuring all of this out that today doesn't really exist. And then from there, you're going to choose how much of that easy button to undo versus how much you want to go. And much like right-click publish in Visual Studio back in the day, going through like Azure App Service, which lots of people still do. Azure Apps. I said back in the day, but then immediately went, you know what? Lots of people are still using App Service, and it's great. It's an amazing like thing if you're just building a web app. It's just not for distributed apps, right? That's what we're talking about. And that thing, like lots of people hated right-click publish with a passion. Like, no, you have to use a CI/CD pipeline. What are you doing? And there were plenty of other people who said, no, this gesture is great. So I expect a very similar split with the Azure Developer CLI. A bunch of people are going to use it. I think of it like right-click publish. Lots of other people are going to be like, no, this is great. Some people are going to use it in their production CI/CD pipelines. Some are going to use it as a starting point. Like, we're going to see everything. The key for Aspire is to give you just enough so that those tool chains can take up the Aspire project and know what they need to fill in and then get going. But increasingly, you're going to start seeing, increasingly in Aspire, I think you're going to start seeing more and more infrastructure as code kind of concepts appear, just because it's natural. You don't have to, but the capability is going to have to exist, and the more and more we explore through this, the more it has become obvious to us.
You mentioned .NET Aspire can hook directly to the Azure Developer command line, AZD. Is that
it's the other way around? Yes. So
the other way around.
AZD knows about Aspire, not Aspire doesn't know about
Is
AZD.
the intent to be for like spinning it up, local developer and testing things out, or does one of the two know about the concept of an environment and intend to eventually deploy and create and deploy all the way to production?
AZD has the concept of an environment and intends to be able to be all the way to production.
Okay.
Whether or not you're comfortable with that, some people hate that. Like, because it does hide a lot, which some people love and some people hate. So the people who don't want that aren't going to use it. But it is designed to be able to give you a path all the way to production.
So what part of this do you think is going to be part of GA this year? And what part of it is that's a next step, but that's our architectural intent?
The AZD experience will GA this year with Aspire, to go to container apps.
Okay.
The Azure container apps. Then you're going to be able to do what we want to do is to give you a very similar experience, like the same easy mode button for vanilla Kubernetes or for Azure Kubernetes service. What's going to be available at GA is likely, there is an open source project that some guys created that can kind of do it. And what I mean by easy mode button is like being able to just do one gesture and you get pointed at a Kubernetes cluster and it builds your .NET apps, publishes them, gets them into the cluster, and publishes Redis and puts the Redis container there as well because it knows you need it. What's going to be available at GA is that's not going to be there. You'll probably, you could use the open source project, but we won't have any like official support for it, probably. And you'll instead do what you do today to deploy to Kubernetes. Like we just won't be. It's not like we would make it any harder. We just won't be making it as easy as the single mode button to get to container apps. But architecturally and like directionally, obviously vanilla Kubernetes is a mainline target for Aspire, and so we want that to be great. It's just but it'll be interesting to see post GA how many people just like easily shift Aspire into their existing patterns and everything is good, as opposed to really need the easy button to go to Kubernetes. the AZD experience just matches so well with container apps, because you're using container apps because you don't want to manage the cluster. You don't want that complexity of all the VMs floating around and things like that. You just want a thing to put containers on. So the idea that I have a single command line gesture that just takes all my containers and goes and runs them over there matches very, very well. Does the same experience resonate with Kubernetes? There's no reason why it can't work, but does it actually resonate with the people who choose to use Kubernetes?
Yeah.
That is the question.
Right.
Don't know. We're going to find out, though.
Sure.
Typically, people who already have a big investment in some of this stuff, they've got big kube configs that they've lovingly handcrafted, want to keep using them, and that's great. Should be able to do that.
Yeah. You mentioned Redis, and there's other .NET Aspire.
I also think we'll move towards function support post GA. You won't. So the other a thing that you can't do today really is put a functions project into an Aspire. That would be something we'll look at post GA. You can imagine a world where you do like an AZD, you publish and you take all your containers and takes your non-functions projects and goes and runs them on some container platform, and then takes your functions projects and runs them on actual functions, and then it kind of split the deployment in that way, just as you would today if you were using functions. So that'll be something that we haven't started investigating yet, but we know roadmap wise it's on the list.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, you were asking a question. So.
Yeah, you mentioned Redis and .NET Aspire packages, and there's no possible way that there's going to be first class Aspire support for everything that you could possibly run. So what is for GA, what do you think it's going to look like for all the different components where there's no .NET Aspire package wrapper for that type of thing yet? But you know what? In my application, I just have to spin up, I don't know, this proprietary little database file. Or you mentioned FoxPro. If they have to peek into a FoxPro database and need that to be part, is there a custom component concept, or is that next step?
Yeah. Okay. This is a super interesting question because it's layered. So the first step is, how do I get the Aspire to launch the thing, to run the database or whatever, right? So within the Aspire app host, it has a concept of resources. And so there's a project, the primitives of that are basically project resource, container resource, executable resource, for example. And then you layer on top of that. So like the Redis, when you go distributed app.add Redis, and that makes the Redis container run, that adds a Redis resource to the builder, which inherits from container resource, which just knows how to run a container, right? So the first thing, if you want to make it feel first class, you create a class that inherits from, if it's a container-based database, inherits from container resource. And then inside there, you create your extension method, and then you create this resource type that has the image name that you expect and the version of that image that you expect and some stuff like that. And then you can go add my custom thing. It's super easy to do. It's only it's like two classes, including the extension methods file. There's one other file. It's fairly trivial amount of code to make that. But alternatively, you could just call add container. So you can go app.add container, give it the image name, and then configure what the endpoint is that container expects, like what port does that container use internally that you're trying to connect to, and then it adds it to the service discovery mechanisms, and everything is good, and you can run it and it runs. You do the same for an executable. Aspire has node support, for example, which ultimately is an executable resource that just invokes node or npm, for example. So you could add your JavaScript front end to your .NET backend is the justification for why we would support it, right?
Got it.
So that is how you would add resources, custom resources and stuff to the system. It's very, very extensible and nice and fluid in that way. I've played around with doing a bunch of vector databases recently, for example, because I was doing RAG, pattern, build your own Copilot kind of work within Aspire. You imagine I have a front end app and I have a worker that's sending documents to doing embeddings for an AI to be able to answer questions about my own content. Then I have an API that is actually asking the AI the questions with prompts, and you can imagine that solution kind of falls together, and then you need specialist databases for that world. I've been playing around with that, and it was all super easy to kind of extend the system to be able to support those. You can also kind of just depend upon an external connection string like you do today. Nothing stops you from writing the code that you would have written today with this spot.
Right. And it has to be already up.
Yeah. The second thing that you said, though, was components. And so that's the resource, how do I get my app to know about the thing and run it? Then then you've got a client SDK to talk to that thing. Maybe there's a FoxPro SDK. If we stick with our example. We don't have an aspire.foxpro. We're probably never going to. So now what do you do? Right. Well, the answer to that is we will publish basically an RFC style spec for a component. So these are all the things that components do. It has to do these things. It should do these things. Here's the examples. This is how you do it. And so the only value of a component is that it does those things. So if you take an arbitrary compliant library and you do the same things that we would have done, that we do for you in the component code, then your usage of that SDK is just as good as any Aspire component. Aspire components are just a standardized way of configuring these things to use within a .NET environment that we know is going to be used for the cloud. And so that's how I would expect you to do that. And then maybe create a wrapper and publish it, and other people could use it. I don't know.
Sure.
And I think that right now, to be an official, in air quotes, I'm air quoting official, Aspire component, you need to be owned by the Aspire account on NuGet. I suspect over time, our intention is that over time we don't become the boss. We don't stay the boss of what is and is not an Aspire component. Eventually, it becomes a kind of group effort of people from the community that kind of own what is an Aspire component, what should the spec say, and they stamp it, as opposed to it all coming from us.
Right.
For now, while we're bootstrapping this whole thing, we just publish them all ourselves. But that is another future roadmap thing where I think over time that this happens. And what's interesting is that frequently some of the components we've already built have changed things. So Redis, when we started, in order to get the logs out of the Redis SDK, you had to shim a text writer into the SDK, is how it worked.
That's fun.
That was a pain. As we said, hey, that sucks. We got to do this config. The Stack Exchange Redis guys were like, yeah, you're right. We should just depend upon the logging libraries. And they took that whole thing away, right? So over time, what we hope is by saying this is how these things are necessary and mandatory for you to be a great quality library within this Aspire ecosystem. We hope Aspire becomes an ecosystem of things that everybody that has so much usage that eventually that becomes norm. It would be great if eventually the Aspire component spec just disappears because that's what everybody does. Or instead of being an Aspire spec, it's just good library spec. But then at that point, there's probably some other aspirational set of things that somebody could do to be even better. And then maybe that's what it evolves to, right? I don't know what the future holds, but there is certainly an amount right now of Aspire of trying to lift up a whole set of things, predominantly around the opinions, because we view Aspire as an opinionated way of doing development that you don't have to agree with. It's an opinion, not the opinion.
Yeah.
And it's centered around this idea that you will use OTEP and telemetry, you will have resiliency patterns, you will be using poly, you will be using DI, and then just making all of those opinions strong, and then putting everything together for you. You make the world. That's the only real way to make the current cloud world manageable. Right? Yeah. And then you've just got to choose the right extensibility points. To your point about resources, but we've gotten pretty good over the years of building good extensible software. Yeah. What we've gotten very bad at because of that is actually holding an opinion in order to simplify what that good extensible software's experience should be.
Right.
And that's another thing that Aspire is trying to do.
Well, that's great. We could talk for a long time about this, but we're out of time. But I want to say, just having had those types of opinionated versus non-opinionated conversations for so long, I'm so happy to hear that y'all are now starting to see the value of having an opinion, as opposed to just, no, everybody wants to do different things. Yeah, but that's different from having an opinion that says you should know if your running thing is healthy or not. That's not a controversial opinion.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, everybody should have a standard for how the telemetry works, so that you can plug in any of the just at this point, basically all the major telemetry and systems and vendors all support the OTel spec. Cool. So what are we doing? Why is it that just use that? Yeah. Everybody.
Right.
Everybody log to the thing, right?
Yeah.
The OTel spec in particular helped us a lot here. We also did a couple of cool things. We knew we wanted to bake poly in. And so we talked to some people. The Teams backend uses poly. There's a bunch of people at Microsoft that use poly. Poly is the resiliency library for .NET. And so we were able to give some engineering help. And if the newest version of poly that had a massive amount of rewrite in it and and I think a few orders of magnitude performance improvement came out of this same effort, because we knew we were going to bake Poly, and so we had a real good look at Poly and had some of the engineers at Microsoft look at Poly's code and said, okay, here's a bunch of ways we could improve Perth, but some of them are breaking changes. And so we're able to go to the creators of Poly and say, here's our ideas. Mm-hmm. We're happy to merge everything if that's what you want. If you want us to go fork or you want us to create something else, we'll do that too. What do you want to do?
Right.
And they said, yeah, just let's do a major version. Let's go. And it was great. So that was, I'm really happy that came out of this effort as well, because everybody just benefits from this way faster Poly, right?
Nice. Well, man, This is a lot of great information, Glenn. Thanks so much for coming back on the podcast and sharing with us the latest in .NET.
I don't know how I was with time. I feel like I talked a lot. It was probably very dense.
It's a lot to cover.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks so much. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.